Okay. Welcome, everyone. I think we're still allowing people to enter and tell us where they're joining us from. We're glad you could join us this evening. Maybe we should go ahead. Do you think we should go ahead and get, okay.
Canada.
Yeah. 2 people from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And Washington. Hi, Janet. Great. Well, maybe we should go ahead and, do you think we should go ahead and start with announcements, Delicia, while people are coming in?
Hello, my name is Delicia Johnson. I am joined tonight by my fellow co-hosts, Inga Brody and Deb Barnum. Our technical director for this episode is Maisie Ferguson, who is an English major and music minor at the University of Kansas. Going all the way back to 2019, Jane Austen and Company has aimed to provide top-notch programming related to Jane Austen.
All right.
So tonight we conclude our spring series on music and the Regency. Back in February, we kicked things off with Jeff Nigro's fabulous talk on Georgian fangirls and the influence that Italian castrati had on Regency music in England. Then we had Jillian Dooley, who's just joined us this evening. I'm glad you're here, Jillian. And she discussed life and work, including some of what she would have played and sang. And most recently, Catherine Libben moved our series outward to women and musical education during this period.
And tonight, Laura Klein will discuss the evolution of keyboard music during this period and consider the music that Austen was practicing when she was writing. And all of our presentations this series, and their series will continue into the fall. We'll have a new batch of episodes. And we're trying to provide widely different perspectives on the subject of music and the Regency. We're also eager to take suggestions if you have ideas about additional panels we can do in the fall. But music making and music appreciation could be complicated and even contested activities during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as we have been discovering. Okay. Alicia?
Please visit our website to get more information about the entire slate of speakers for this series and to watch recordings. Our website is janeaustenandco.org. In addition, I wanted to take a few minutes to advertise the 2025 Jane Austen Summer Program. As I'm sure you all know, 2025 is the 250th birthday of Jane Austen, and so JAS is celebrating the occasion with a special version of the Jane Austen Summer Program taking place in New Bern, North Carolina, with a theme of sensibility and domesticity. During our 4-day symposium, we will explore topics including medicine, birth, and domestic arts in Regency, England, and colonial North Carolina. We'll focus on Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, considering the birth of her career as a published writer, as well as taking a transatlantic look at the world into which she was born. Our website, janeaustensummer.org, contains information about registering, travel, and accommodations, and more.
So we traditionally host this JASP in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Thanks to a generous grant from the North Carolina Humanities, we're able to take JASP on the road this summer to explore colonial connections to Austen in a unique way. New Bern is home to Tryon Palace, the first permanent capital of the colony of North Carolina and home to the royal governor, William Tryon, and his family. As an aside, for Outlander fans, in season 6 in the year 1775, Claire Fraser is taken to the palace where she's held in the basement and tasked with tending to the ailing governor's wife. New Bern also has piratical connections to Blackbeard and his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, as well as to Stephen Bonnet, also in the Outlander series, but based on the historical gentleman pirate, Stead Bonnet. But Outlander aside, the coastal location of New Bern is perfect for exploring the relevance of the Navy and the sea to Austen's novels as well.
In fact, we have a speaker talking about the piratical connections.
Yeah.
Rakes and pirates in the Regency. All right. And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Laura Klein, pianist and historical musicologist. She specializes in British keyboard music and performance practices of the long 18th century. Her current research centers on the music contained in the Jane Austen family music books that are in the collection. She founded the Jane Austen playlist in 2019. It's a historical music project that features the music of the Austen family in digitized notations, companion recordings, and dramatically narrated performances. We're actually hoping that we actually are planning to collaborate with Laura on Jane Austen's desk once we start animating that piano in the side of the room. An active performer and presenter, she gives frequent concerts and lecture recitals, both online throughout the United States and in the United Kingdom. She's performed at, is it 2 of the annual International Jane Austen Society of annual gatherings? Yeah. And she is an affiliate professor of piano at Colorado Christian University and is completing her PhD at UC Boulder.
Before Laura begins her talk, our technical director, Maisie, will explain how you can send in questions during and after their performance.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to YouTube, our streaming platform. If you would like to leave a comment or ask a question, please use the comment feature on the sidebar. We'll collect your comments throughout the performance, and during the Q&A after the performance, Laura can answer them. So please get those questions and comments in because we love to hear from you. You will need to log into your Google or YouTube account to post using the comment feature on the sidebar. If you do not have a YouTube or Google account, that's okay. You can submit your questions to info@janeaustenandco.org. We'll collect questions there as well and ask them for you, and I will place that email in the chat.
And now, without further ado, we present Laura Klein and her presentation on From Air to Arrangement, the Evolution of Keyboard Music in Austen's Era.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to the team of Jane Austen and Company for their invitation to be a part of this program. Music in the Regency is, as you've heard in the introduction, it's my specialty and it's also my passion, and I love sharing these types of details. So I'm looking forward to sharing this time with you guys today. So as it was introduced, I am the founder and creator of the Jane Austen playlist, and it's a project that researches and digitizes and records the music in the Austen family books, some of which we will view in this presentation today. The focus of today's discussion is a multifaceted history of a form of music that was very popular in the 18th century, and we're going to examine how it shows up in the writings and the music of Jane Austen. Next slide, please. So the air, or air as it was spelled in Old English, is defined in the Harvard Dictionary of Music, 4th edition, as, quote, a tune, whether vocal or instrumental, an English lute-accompanied song of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, or a movement in a suite. Next slide, please. English airs were first produced in the royal court of England toward the end of the 16th century and enjoyed considerable popularity through the first part of the 17th century. They were similar to the Italian modity and French air de coeur, accompanied solo songs that were popular on the continent. English airs, while mostly solo songs, would occasionally contain additional vocal parts, and they were almost exclusively accompanied by lute. Their popularity began with the publication of John Dowland's first book of songs or airs in 1597. His most famous airs include Flow My Tears, I Saw My Lady Weep, and In Darkness Let Me Dwell. Thomas Campion was another composer and poet who further popularized the genre. His book of airs, co-written with Philip Rossiter and published in 1601, contains over 100 lute songs and was reprinted 4 times in the 1610s. Although this printing boom died out in the 1620s, airs continued to be written and performed and were often incorporated into court masques, which were popular court entertainments of the day. And then in the 16th and 17th century, ballad tunes were like folk songs. Everyone knew them at court or in the country. Each ballad began its life as a tune with an accompanying story. The original tunes kept their name, but during the course of time, new stories were often set to the original ballad tunes. Known as broadsides, which so called because they were usually printed on a large sheet known as a broadside, the ballads were medium for current social and political comment. Serious composers such as Dowland or Bird often took ballad tunes and set them for keyboard, lute, or consort in versions with variations. Next slide. The lute, a strung instrument with a tortoise-shaped back, was one of the most popular of the perfect instruments, which are instruments which could play all the parts of a composition instead of just one line. Lutes were popular in the Middle Ages for playing one line, but during the latter part of the 15th century, players began to experiment with playing more contrapuntal, which means multi-voiced, works. Lutes were among the earliest instruments to develop a solo repertoire, but also from about the middle of the 16th century, it became expected that they would participate in ensembles with other instruments as a kind of continuo. Later Renaissance makers also devised lutes with extended necks, which were known by such names as archlute, theorbo, or chitarrone. The larger ones were frequently single rather than double strung and were prized as accompanying instruments, although they also possessed their own solo literature. The song we're about to hear, Weep You No More, Sad Fountains, demonstrates beautifully the role of the lute with the voice. Written by Renaissance composer and lutenist John Dowland, this text has also been the inspiration for many arrangements for voice and an accompanying instrument since, including, you might recognize the title from Patrick Doyle's soundtrack for Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility. This is a song that Kate Winslet performs. This is not the same one. This is the Dowland version. And so we'll go ahead and hear a clip of that right now. So this should be video 1. We might be having difficulty. Oh, there we go. We might go ahead and skip that for now. It doesn't seem like it's coming up on that end. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So as lute and keyboard instrumental music gained momentum, composers incorporated them in their own works, either based on a pre-existing tune or as original works. By the 18th century, composers had begun to write airs for instruments and ensembles without a voice. They were song-like lyrical pieces and often served as movements in a larger composition. Some of the best-known airs are by Bach and Handel. Handel, who was in England for much of his later life, wrote the fifth movement of his suite in F major, which is part of his water music collection. It's an air. Bach also wrote several airs, many of which show up as movements in his partitas for keyboard. The theme for his monumental Goldberg variations is also an air. However, his best-known air is the second movement to his Suite Number 3 in D major, air on the G string, which is one that's familiar to most people who listen to Bach. We do have another video here. If this one doesn't share, I'll continue. We'll give it a chance to try to play. So if that one is one that's familiar to you, air on the G string, of course, the air is, again, this idea of the 18th century instrumental work. And as we could see in the video, this was a group called Voices of Music, and they do performances with period instruments, meaning instruments that would have been used during the time. We saw a keyboard instrument there. So moving to the next slide, we'll see that the lute wasn't the only instrument that was known for accompanying airs. Keyboard instruments, such as those pictured on this slide, became popular in the courts and for use in musical instruction. The clavichord, shown on the left, is the first known strung keyboard instrument, and it showed up in the 1300s. The first harpsichords, which you'll see in the middle picture, emerged around the same time, followed by the virginal, which is pictured on the right, and it was an instrument that was popular in Queen Elizabeth's court. The clavichord, which was the first instrument to use a device to hit the strings similar to that of the piano, could create a slight dynamic range, but they were typically very quiet and so didn't have a lot of loud and soft. Harpsichords and virginals, which were instruments that use a plucking mechanism to create sound on the string, can be louder, yet they have little to no dynamic fluctuation. They were also challenging to use due to their very narrow range of dynamics and their fragility. So then moving to the next slide, we will see the earliest pianos. In 1700, an inventory of instruments at the Florentine court of Grand Prince Ferdinando de' Medici lists an arpicimbalo, which is an instrument newly invented by Bartolomeo Cristofori, resembling a harpsichord that included dampers, hammers, 2 keyboards, and a range of 4 octaves. This first pianoforte, named for its ability to make the loud and soft sounds, and eventually we ended up just removing the forte and we call it the piano today, it quickly became a prototype for succeeding keyboard instruments. By the time Jane Austen was born, 75 years later, instrument makers in London were producing pianofortes in the thousands. The grand pianoforte, pictured on the left, was like the harpsichord in shape and exterior design, and it was a prototype for what we know now as the modern concert grand. The sound was richer and fuller in tone than any keyboard instrument yet constructed, allowing for contrast in articulation and dynamics. This in turn brought it into increasing popularity during the 18th century. However, not unlike the modern grands of the 20th and 21st centuries, they required a rather large footprint, perfect for the music rooms of the gentry, but much too large for the drawing rooms of the middle class, in which the instrument played a central role. So then we enter the square piano, which you'll see on the right, a design that emerged in England in the 1760s by a German immigrant to London named Johann Zump. Rectangular in shape, the square piano quickly developed in quality and popularity over the next several decades, as it was small enough to accommodate moderately sized drawing rooms while still providing the appearance of gentility and accomplishment sought after by young ladies of good breeding. For those of you who have visited Jane Austen's house in Chawton, you'll also recognize this as a similar instrument to what is in the drawing room at the cottage there. Speaking of young ladies, good breeding, etc., let's turn our attention for a few minutes to the roles instruments played alongside the developing air in relation to gender. In 1783, German composer Karl Ludwig Juncker wrote an essay that explained which instruments were proper for women to play. Orchestral instruments, or instruments performed in a professional setting, were strictly for men. This was, as he wrote, because orchestral instruments threatened the concept of a woman's natural subservient role, and it compromised her decorum. However, keyboard instruments and the guitar were appropriate as they allowed for female musicians to maintain their natural graceful poses. Additionally, as music historian Eric Stenstadvold explains, both instruments were also made for, quote, simple, unpretentious music, most of all in a subordinate role as an accompanying instrument, end quote. And then moving to the next slide, we'll see another instrument that was also used as an accompanying instrument for airs, and one that was popular among the young ladies was the harp. It's one of the oldest surviving musical instruments and was a favored instrument in the British Isles. Lever harps developed from lap harps in the 17th century, further evolving into pedal harps, which is the type of harp that Mary Crawford played, and is also what is pictured here in Angelica Kaufman's painting on the left. Jane Austen's cousin, Eliza, who later married Austen's brother Henry, played a pedal harp made in Paris in 1777. Mike Parker, who you see pictured on the right, is a UK-based historical musicologist who tracked down Eliza's harp and had it restored. It is now the oldest known working pedal harp in the UK. The harp was also acceptable for women to play, as it didn't require awkward contortions of the body that would disrupt their graceful pose, and because it was often used as an accompanying instrument. The harp was also a symbol of status and musical accomplishment. As Austen wrote about Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park, quote, a young woman, pretty, lively, with a harp as elegant as herself, and both placed near a window, cut down to the ground, and opening on a little lawn, surrounded by shrubs in the rich foliage of summer, was enough to catch any man's heart, end quote. The piano became by far, however, the most popular instrument of choice for females. Zump's square piano design didn't change the way that the player approached the piano, and it was also much more affordable. Therefore, it allowed for their demeanor to remain intact, and it allowed them an instrument to be able to play and to use to demonstrate. It was also an accompanying instrument which fit the bill for Junker's stipulation that women maintain their proper place in their subordinate roles. This next musical clip is an example of a type of air accompanied on the pianoforte. Mary's Dream is a Scottish air from circa 1772 and is performed here by soprano Elizabeth Hetherington and pianist Anders Muskin on an English square piano that was built by Longman and Broderick near around 1788 in London. The lyrics are attributed to the Scottish writer John Lowe, who set it to music by English composer John Rolfe. Here's a short clip of that.
The moon had climbed the highest hill, which rises o'er the source
As you've already seen, this is a Scotch air, which we will return to because Scotch airs were very popular in the 18th century. But returning first to how airs continue to develop, moving on to the next slide, all three of these instruments, the harp, the lute, and the keyboard instrument, lent themselves to proper playing and singing. And regardless of which instrument they were played, airs were extremely popular forms. In Britain, as we just heard, the vocal forms were typically popular poems set to folk tunes of Scottish or Irish origins. Despite their native origins, these airs were often printed in the traditional format, a vocal line over a bass line that may or may not be figured. The practice of thorough bass, which brings to minds of Pride and Prejudice readers Mary Bennett's studious application of the practice, was a tradition of notating the bass line of a piece with figures often added underneath to communicate the harmonic function of the accompaniment. You can see that in the picture on the slide. You can see where there are little numbers that are underneath the bottom staff on each of the parts. It was the job of the player to realize or to create, based off of the implied harmonies, the accompaniment throughout the piece. This they accomplished through significant training and practice of the skill, using both improvisatory and compositional methods. In the 17th and early parts of the 18th century, amateurs were often as highly skilled as professional musicians through the training they received as part of their education. And it wasn't only men who received this training. As Mary Sear examines in her essay, Origins and Performance, women who were trained in convents, boarding schools, or under the tutelage of music masters were often quite accomplished in playing and in other musicianship skills. Moving to the next slide, we'll see that these songs were often served as the basis for many of the keyboard works of that time. As the 18th century progressed, these varying forms of arranged keyboard solos were significant to the development of keyboard compositional practices, particularly as the practice of realizing the bass line began to decline in the latter part of the 18th century. This was due to a number of reasons, including the explosive development of the piano and the increased ownership of instruments in the upper and middle class homes. By the 19th century, it was largely unstudied, enough to compel explanation. Dr. John Clark, in the introduction to his 1821 keyboard adaptation of Thomas Arne's opera Artaxerxes, states the following, quote, "In offering the following adaptation of Artaxerxes to the public, I have been chiefly actuated by the desire of rendering the performance of it practicable to those who have not made the scientific part of music their peculiar study." End quote. Or, in other words, he's talking about the study of musicianship skills through music theory, which would have included figured bass. Therefore, arrangements became the practice through necessity. The slide you see here shows a reprint from the 1790s of the original keyboard reduction on the left, or the keyboard reduction meaning the parts of the orchestra compiled for solo keyboard. The bass line from the orchestra continuo was carried over, which would have been played on a keyboard instrument. And this is evident in the sparseness of the bottom staff and the presence of the numbered figures that you'll see throughout. The picture on the right is of the arrangement of Dr. Clark. While he did an admirable job filling out the parts, you can see that the figures have disappeared as the harmonies have been more fully realized throughout the texture, seen in the red and the green boxes. And then the bottom staff is more active. Side note, you'll also see that the range of the bass has expanded, as can be seen in the yellow box. The notes go down further on the staff. And this reveals that the keyboard was expanding along with the development of the arrangement. Now, on our next slide, we get to turn to Austen, because we now know that it is a truth universally acknowledged that an accomplished woman in possession of a musical instrument must be in want of an heir. Austen had both, and the manifestation of accomplishment that she had is exemplified through her literary works and her musical collection. It is unknown when she began her musical studies. Some scholars have traced the possibility back to her time with Anne Colley in Oxford in 1783, And this would seem to be corroborated by the presence of Mrs. Colley's music books in the Austen family collection, although how they originally came to be in the same collection is unverified. She may have also had musical training during her time at the Reading Abbey Girls' School from 1785 to 1786. But regardless of the origins of her training, we do know that she took lessons for a time during the 1790s from a Dr. George William Chard, who was a lay clerk of Winchester Cathedral who went on to become the organist of the cathedral and its adjoining college. Austen's continued dedication to the instrument is verified through accounts of her life, given both by herself and through recollections from her family members. This commitment is further revealed through the music found in her collection. These scores demonstrate the access she had to much of the music that was being printed and performed in London. And also throughout most of her life, she had an instrument either by possession or through hire, or she had access as her brother, Edward Austen Knight, maintained a variety of pianofortes at his Chawton and Godmersham estates that were at her disposal when she visited. She played very pretty tunes, I thought, and I liked to stand by her and listen to them. Much that she played was from manuscript, copied out by herself, and so neatly and correctly that it was as easy to read as print. The manuscripts that Caroline Austen recollects in this quote are still in existence, and they are indeed copied so neatly and correctly that they are much easier to read than many of the other manuscripts in the collection. Frozen in time, not unlike a work of art, these scores represent hours and hours of careful copying and practicing. More significantly, they provide a thorough view of the music that was popular during the latter part of the 18th century and into the 19th. The music that Austen was playing gives us a glimpse of how this keyboard music was evolving during the time. I will be using Austen's personal collection as a case study to further examine the evolution of airs to arrangements for the keyboard. But before I continue, it is important to place the music in context with her writing. Austen's music collection was well underway when she wrote her juvenilia works and was mostly complete by the time of her first novel's publication of Sense and Sensibility in 1811. Austen does not specify titles in her music scenes, with exception to one scene, which we will examine later. Yet she frequently mentions airs. In fact, it is the most commonly mentioned musical form besides that of the dance. In Sense and Sensibility, Marianne pours out her grief over Willoughby's abandonment through every air in which they had joined their voices. Mary Bennet, in Pride and Prejudice, was glad to purchase praise and gratitude by Scotch and Irish airs at the request of her younger sisters eager to dance. During Jane and Lizzie's extended stay at Netherfield, several chapters later, Miss Bingley varied the charm of her playing by engaging in a lively Scotch air. In Mansfield Park, Mary Crawford offers to Edmund that she will prepare her most plaintive airs for Tom's return on the harp. There is no direct use of the term in Emma, yet Austen uses its synonym of Irish melodies when she writes the dialogue between Emma and Frank Churchill. While they discuss the music that was sent along with the mysterious gift of the pianoforte, Jane Fairfax is at the piano playing Robin Adair, which is the one titled piece. We'll return to this in a moment. In Persuasion, Captain Wentworth attempts to make out an air at the instrument following an evening of dancing at the Musgroves. It isn't surprising, given Catherine Morland's dislike of lessons, that music, aside from dancing, is rarely mentioned in Northanger Abbey. There is no mention of an air or a song. However, her juvenilia includes another mention. In Lady Leslie's letter to her friend, Miss Charlotte Luttrell, she bemoans the Scotch presence of just about everything, including Scotch airs, at Leslie Castle. As you can see, airs, particularly Scotch and Irish ones, were on vogue during the time of Austen's writing, and for good reason. There are thousands of them, and a good number are included in the Austen Family Music Books collection in varying forms. So now we get to return our attention to Robin Adair, which we'll take a look at in the next slide based on how it shows up in solo keyboard form. One of the popular songs being Robin Adair, not just because of Austen, but it was during the 18th century. This is the solo title piece in Austen's novel and is mentioned by Frank Churchill. It's Mr. Dixon's favorite piece, played by Jane Fairfax. It not only shows up in Austen's novel, but it is in the Austen collection. On the left is the song version with a written out accompaniment, and on the right is a theme preceding a set of 5 variations. The variations were the Keelmark, who wrote the variations, were printed in 1812 and almost certainly being played by Austen when she began writing Emma on January 21, 1814. Here is a performance of the theme and a few variations. So we'll move to a video now. Moving to the next slide, we'll see a few examples in Austen's handwriting from one of her personal volumes of scores. Example 1 on the top left is a simple arrangement of a Scotch air. This is not an arrangement like what we just heard. It's just an instrumental tune realized for keyboard. Let's take a quick listen to that. on the top right of the slide, we have variations on My Love, She's But a Lassie Yet. Variations were based on tunes like that of the Scotch air. However, instead of leaving these airs to stand on their own, composers added variations on the theme with a variety of stylistic and musical features that were common during the 18th century. This also encouraged improvisation, which was still a popular practice of the time. These variations included a melody over a moving bass accompaniment, with turns and ornaments added, or arpeggiated figures, as you'll hear in the first variations of this next clip. This next clip will be just the theme and first variation. We'll hear the theme first, and then we'll hear some of those musical elements in the variation. The bottom two pictures on the slide are actually of a duet, which were becoming increasingly popular during this time. Fun fact, the first four-hand piano duet was actually set into motion by an 8-year-old Mozart when he was on his London tour, and they became very popular. This would have been in the 1760s. So this duet is actually based on an Irish tune that's called My Lodging is on the Cold Ground, but it's better known under the title of Endearing Young Charms. It is also a theme and variation set. The collection contains quite a few duets, but this is one of the only sets of variations on an air. Moving on to the next slide, we'll see a few pictures of the rediscovery of the volume of music bearing Austen's signature that was donated to Chawton House a few years ago. When I was in Chawton, I had the distinct pleasure of arriving a week following this rediscovery. And it is the first volume of Domenico Corri's select collection of choice music for the harpsichord or pianoforte. It had been missing for over 50 years. Upon its rediscovery and being gifted to Chawton House, it is now a part of the collection there, and I had the pleasure of being able to play several of the pieces on one of my visits there. It contains sonatas, concertos, marches, overtures, dances, duets, and variations on Scottish and Irish airs for both solo and accompanied pianoforte. The repertoire throughout this volume is a mixture of works appearing in print circa 1790 and is compiled of arrangements of works by composers who are still very much recognized today, such as Haydn, Handel, and Mozart, as well as names that have been virtually forgotten, such as Koteluk, Mulder, and Schottky. They're fabulous. These pieces are fantastic. I've begun the process of recording these works, and it is my hope to bring these pieces back to the foreground of 18th century British keyboard music. Also, as a side note, you'll see the picture on the far right of the screen. It's a lone handwritten page that was copied in due to printing errors during the time or after it was purchased. It's suspiciously like Austen's writing, although we can't say for absolute certainty at this point in time if it is. One of the pieces that's in there is what you'll see pictured on the slide here. Some of the other pieces consist of Scotch and Irish airs reworked into varying forms by T.H. Butler and Domenico Corey. As I've listed some of them here, you'll see that lessons were essentially pieces that focused on a particular musical skill or idea, not unlike the etude of the 19th century. Duets were also common forms by this point, seen by many teachers as a way of developing their students' sensibilities and sympathetic responses at the instrument. While sonatas and rondos had been the style for much of the past century on the continent, they were normally original compositions. In Britain, however, Corey, among others, often incorporated airs into their movements, as you see here. This is the Andante movement from Corey's Opus 5, number 3 sonata, Where Have You Been a Day, Bonnie Laddie? The last example that I will share today is not a Scotch or Irish air at all, but it is an example of a melody that traversed the English Channel, became popularized in London, and changed its title in the process. This piece, bearing a military title in Austen's manuscript, is actually an aria, which is the Italian version of an air, adapted from Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro. To me, this excerpt in Austen's manuscript reveals the popularity of recycling works that became common in this era, further substantiating the importance of popular pre-existing tunes in the development of keyboard music during this time. And in this video, you'll also recognize, it's a familiar place. If you haven't been there in person, you'll at least recognize it from pictures. This is on the square piano in Jane Austen's house drawing room. Moving to the next slide, which is our concluding slide, airs in the British Isles have served to influence the evolution of music making and music output for centuries. They impacted the development of musical form in both vocal and instrumental styles, shaped the progression of musical instruments and their use, and were also instrumental in considerations of gender and social constructs over time. Keyboard music, in particular, was affected by the application of melodies in forms that were popularized throughout the 18th century. This, in turn, created impact on its expansion and the maturity of stylistic musical elements and performance practices into the 19th century. While an abundance of keyboard music exists from the continent during this era, Britain's music is far more obscure. Yet the British Isles have a rich repertoire of keyboard arrangements that developed from its air tradition, particularly those of Scottish and Irish origins. These airs and arrangements are well represented in the Austen family music books, as we have explored today. Furthermore, they have played a role in literature, creating interrelational aspects between genres and how we perceive both music and text. As the popularity of Austen continues strong at the 250-year anniversary since her birth, her music and the role it plays in her work serves as a channel of reviving British keyboard music and reflects the value of a significant form that is quintessential to music and its development from her time and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. It's a fun topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Was that you in the last video play?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was a couple of years ago when I was in. I was actually a Reimagine resident for Jane Austen's house during that time. I did some recordings there. My hair was a lot shorter at that point. It was also very cold. You can't see the temperature in the video, but it was very cold in the room. It was in January.
Well, you've inspired several questions here from our audience, so we'll
Great.
take a look at some of those. But maybe I think actually a good place to start might be with the question about what do we know about Jane Austen's the piano at Chawton House? Can you tell us about it?
Yes. So the piano that's actually at the cottage right now is not the one that she owned. It's a Clementi and Sons. We think that the piano she owned was Broadwood because that's what Edward Austen Knight used, her brother. He used the Broadwoods in both his Chawton House and his Godmersham estate. So we don't know where that piano is. The Clementi square piano that's in the drawing room right now is from a similar time and is essentially a replica of. Clementi at the time, he was very popular. He was kind of a jack of all trades. He was not only a composer, he was a teacher, he built pianos, he printed music, he arranged music, he did all sorts of things. So it's fitting that if we can't have the actual piano that she had, that we have one that's similar, especially because of a lot of Clementi's music shows up in the collection as well. So it's kind of a fun little connection. We do know that she got a pianoforte. She wrote a letter to her sister Cassandra right before they moved to the Chawton Cottage there, that she said that we will have a pianoforte, as much as one that can be bought for 30 guineas. So we know that she had one and she practiced there, as we saw from Caroline Austen's quote in the discussion.
I'm just trying to, sorry, one follow-up. I'm trying to remember whether when Frank gives Emma the pianoforte, is it a Broadwood? I can't remember whether it's specified or not.
It's, I believe, yes, I believe it is. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, it's specified as a Broadwood. But that would have been a grand one, which is so one of the ones that we saw in the picture where it was the bigger, the one that took a big footprint, which is one of the reasons that they talk about the inconvenience of having the instrument, because it was such a big instrument that was being delivered from at the point. Who knew where?
Thank you.
Yes. So
you're muted, Deb.
I was just going to pick that one.
The music of Beethoven being played in England during Jane Austen's lifetime. Yes, it was, but it wasn't as popular. It wasn't as, we know that Haydn had his London years. Mozart had his London years. Beethoven did make it there, but his music wasn't quite as popular during that time. It never shows up in her collection either. And so it's interesting that we have some of the music from the continent, but not others, depending on how it just was disseminated across the channel.
Do you think it was somehow it didn't fit as well the taste as Mozart did at the time, or what?
I would say that would have a lot to do with it, and Haydn, of course, the same type of music. Beethoven was his music as he got older was very experimental. He's really one of the composers who helped to usher in the Romantic era, and so while his music was popular, and he was popular and recognized on the continent, because he didn't spend as much time there, we don't see as much of the music that was there. It was a lot, especially during the 1810s and 1820s. It was a lot heavier.
So here's one. Why do you think the undercurrent of animosity between the British and the Irish and Scottish during the Regency?
That is a great question. I feel like a lot of it had to do with the fact that because there was so many, after we had the Jacobite uprising, and then they were quelled, of course, in 1746. There were a lot of people who were then their loyalties were bought. Scottish, the loyalty of Scottish citizens were bought, and then they were offered a place in the military. They were offered this be a part of England. And so by the time you get into the latter half of the 18th century, there was a lot more travel that was happening, especially because Edinburgh, which was the center of Scottish art and culture, which is where a lot of this music was being printed. Corey was in Edinburgh. And so a lot of this music was being kind of passed between Edinburgh and London as the two big cultural centers there. So by the time we get to the latter part of the 18th century, the animosity seems to have not been as much of an impact, because there was a lot more focus on the culture and the style of what the Regency was and how things were happening. So I think while there were still some undercurrents, especially from the north of Scotland, we don't see that as much because of the way that Edinburgh kind of joined forces with, in a cultural way, in the Regency, joined forces with England.
Interesting.
Delicia, did you?
So,
Delicia,
mention on how airs are shown played in Austen's novels. Do you connect? Do Austen connect any airs to her inspiration? Do you connect any airs to her inspiration in the creation of her heroine or other characters?
Yeah, well, especially like when you think of Marianne and the fact that Marianne was such a she used the instrument and her music almost as a journal. It was a way that she helped to document and to process her feelings and how she was experiencing things. Airs were, of course, something that she shared with Willoughby, and I think that there was that connection there as far as the idea of the air, and then how it became a style that is kind of quintessential to Marianne's character, at least in the first part of the book. And then I also think too, airs, because they tended to be a little bit simpler, especially if they were ones that were sung or they weren't developed into larger genres. They were pieces that were very accessible in terms of being able to sit down and play it. So a lot of Austen's heroines, as we know, are not super accomplished at the instrument. Lizzie, of course, said she was not as good because she wouldn't take the trouble of practicing. And so an air would have been an easier piece for her to sit down and play, as opposed to something that was very virtuosic or flashy, considered virtuosic or flashy at the time. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that airs show up in each of the book, and that there's so much of this style that's happening during this time, because it was music that was accessible. So I hope that answers the question.
Here's sort of a follow-up.
Okay. Deb, why don't you let Delicia speak?
Delicia, go ahead.
This is an interesting one. What do you think Austen is saying about pianoforte prodigies versus those who don't practice as much? It's interesting to compare that Emma doesn't practice as much as Jane Fairfax does.
Yes. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, actually, and I'm in the process of writing a paper on this. Because we know that Jane Austen was accomplished herself, and she practiced, and it was something that she was very committed to. Yet we also know that music was considered to be a form of accomplishment as a way of husband hunting, or a way of exhibiting yourself as someone who was accomplished during that time. And my opinion is, and what I'm fleshing out in this paper, is that Austen does not make any of her main characters, her main protagonists, super accomplished, because it's her way of subtly snubbing her nose at what was considered to be the accomplished woman at the time. So that's why I think that Emma is not as accomplished as Jane Fairfax. Lizzie is not as accomplished as Mary Bennet, or Caroline Bingley. Catherine just gives up at age 8 and doesn't want to practice at all. So I think that has something to do with the fact that Austen is using music of the time to stand on its own merit, instead of being a tool in the type of marriageability, suitability that women were expected to have at the time.
That's very interesting. I look forward to the paper on that.
Yeah.
Someone here is clarifying for us that it did indeed say the pianoforte had Broadwoods the day before.
From Broadwoods. Yes. Emma has a lot of, that's where Robin Adair, it's the only titled piece. That's where you also have the only titled composer. She mentions Cromer, who was a composer at the time, and some of Cromer's music shows up in the Austen collection as well. And then, of course, we have the Broadwood. I don't know that we don't have these specific mentions anywhere else in the novels. So it's interesting that it shows up in Emma.
That's so interesting. I was going to just ask a follow-up on the Scottish, and I was wondering too about why Scottish and Irish airs. I mean, that's what Austen refers to, not English airs.
Right.
And so I'm thinking it may actually be a little bit related to the earlier question, because aren't airs also, they're associated with folk tunes. They're associated with kind of the more primitive, or the whole pre-romantic thing about in the philosophy of language, about that the earlier languages were more attuned to song and music, and earlier cultures were more. So I feel like there's a kind of interesting cultural prejudice that's also perhaps that establishes that connection. But I mean, obviously, you would know far better. I'm just wondering.
Right. Well, so what's interesting too is we have, we saw the piece from Marriage of Figaro that was in the collection there, the last video that I played, and that is a demonstration on the continent. This was also happening. I mean, Mozart wrote his theme and variations on French folk tunes, and Beethoven wrote on folk tunes as well. And so it was something that was happening on the continent. And I think Scottish and Irish tunes were also a little bit more exotic, for the lack of a better term, in the urban centers, as opposed to it being something that was recognized or popular. And yeah, the accessibility of, there were tunes that a lot of people knew, and so it brought the music just as the instrument was being brought into the drawing rooms, and they were increasingly popular. The music was also something that was becoming accessible in that way, and more explored at the time too. Yeah.
So here's sort of a follow-up to that. Is there evidence of the British reworking music from other regions other than Europe, such as India, the Americas, and Africa?
Not as much, although there are references to, but the Western classical music and the traditions of the 17th and 18th century had a very strong hold on composers in both the UK, in Britain, and on the continent. And so they were reworked more in the Western style of what classical composition was at the time. So you may see a theme, or you may see a hint of, there are a couple references in the Austen collection actually of a Hindu girl, but they're very Western themed as far as they don't sound like something that you would hear from a non-Western culture. So I know, but by the time you get to Americas, which is actually one of the things that I'm going to be talking about this summer at the Jane Austen Summer Program, is how music then comes to America, and how the music in the Americas was influenced by the British Isles and by the continent, and that there was some shift that happened. It was very eclectic and unique in the Americas to a certain extent. But a lot of it was more just the Western reworking of something into what their traditions were.
Thank you.
Delicia, do you see a question?
Oh, this is an interesting one. What was the process of discovering what types of music would have been popular during the different novel eras of Austen?
So much fun. That's where the musicologist nerd in me comes out, because of the fact that she doesn't title the pieces. She only titles some of the forms, and she also talks a lot about the instrument. But we also know that while she was writing, she was practicing, and we know what was in the collection. And so that's actually how I came to found the Jane Austen playlist, was after a visit to England in 2018, and I was at Jane Austen's house and started, really digging into the collection more, and I started to see correlations between the collection and between her novels and what she was writing at the time, and there were influences that seemed to go back and forth between those. And so it's really fascinating to look at the music, and then to just start exploring and discovering, like, okay, so this was a handwritten piece that she had in her manuscript. Where did it come from? Where was the origin of that from? Some of them we know, some of them we don't. But once we get into the late 18th, early 19th century, British keyboard music is a lot, as I was saying before in the presentation, it was a lot more obscure, so it's a lot harder. So in a way, as much as it's really fascinating and it's a lot of fun, there's a lot of sleuthing that happens. I know that Jillian Dooley is on here, and she spoke a month ago. She's done a lot of this work as well, and she's found some connections. And so but again, because there's not as much music that was being that was in the that was established in the canon at that time. We don't have it we don't have as much access to that. So it's a lot of digging.
Ellen Moody has a question here about, or a comment about the expense of the pianoforte. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about relative expense of these sizes, or of the harp versus the pianoforte.
Right. Well, so when Austen writes to Cassandra and she mentions the 30 guineas, this would of course been in 1808. And this was, 30 guineas in 1808 was, just a little over 3,000 pounds in today's conversion. And that would have been, whatever piano she could get for that, which would have been a nicer square piano. I mean, you could get, when Zuma started building his square pianos, and this was in the 1760s and 1770s, you could get them for as inexpensive as like 10 guineas, which, I mean, that's still a considerable amount, but it was a lot less than the 30 that Austen mentioned in the first part of the 19th century. And then, of course, the grand pianofortes would have been much more. They would have been well into, 8,000-10,000 pounds in today's conversion. I think one of the articles that I was reading in preparation for another lecture that I gave a couple of weeks ago was the discussion of the fact that a lot of them could go up to 75 or 80 guineas during the latter part of the 18th century, which would have been, Mr. Darcy could have afforded it, but not a lot of other people would have been able to. So yeah, so they were expensive, especially now when you consider, you can go on Facebook Marketplace now and, people are giving them away for free. Come pick this piano up, please. So a little bit different.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the cost of tuning today, right? And so I'm curious about I'm sorry, this is kind of a second question, but like the issue of tuning and who tuned the instruments.
So a lot of it would be if there was a music master, there was a music tutor in the area. There were also tuners who were technicians at the time who were in that part. They're not hard to tune like our modern pianos are. Our modern pianos are a lot more challenging because of how they developed through the 19th century. They were originally just one string per key, whereas now we have up to 3. And the way that they're tuned slightly out of tune with each other now so that they give a richer, more rounder sound. And of course, you don't have to worry about that on an 18th or early 19th century piano. And so it's just, essentially you can have a tuning hammer that you use to adjust the tuning, which there's Jane Austen had one, and I don't know somebody, it belongs to somebody, I cannot remember the name of the person who is now in possession of it, but that gives us an indication that maybe she potentially could have tuned her own instrument, even though we don't really have much of a record of that. So yeah, tuning did play a role in that.
Thank you.
So I had a question. Are any of the movie adaptations, do any of them get the music for playing and or dancing completely wrong, and any that get it completely right?
That's a great question. Yes. And yes, I will be the first to admit that the music is one of the first things that I listen to in a movie. And I absolutely love the soundtracks for the film adaptations. Yeah. That being said, they're not always very historically accurate. And so in my opinion, one of the ones that gets it the best or gets it the closest is the 2020 version of Emma. Because of the way that a lot of the folk tunes were pulled into the music. There's a lot of that late 18th century stylistic, the musical styles that were taking place at that time, the stylistic elements that are in the music are very similar to what there are the original compositions that the film score writers put in there, but then the ones that they created themselves are definitely more like what you would have from that era. As much as I hate to say it, the 2005 Pride and Prejudice does get it wrong. There are a couple pieces in there that are a little bit more accurate, but they're very early because there's a lot of Purcell tunes, and Purcell was the latter part of the 17th century, and so it would have been during the Regency. You didn't have it was all about what was new and popular. There wasn't a lot of the older music that was being pulled into it, so it was unlikely that you would have heard a lot of the music that was almost a century old at that point.
Yeah, it's beautiful though.
Oh, I mean, it's one of my favorites. I love it. I love to play it. So I'm not dissing it in any way, shape, or form.
So are there any other questions? Alicia, did you have anything? All right.
I have an off-the-wall question. If you want to, unless
Those are
Lisa,
good.
you want to go. Lisa, do you have one?
I don't know if you would necessarily know the answer to this. It just kind of popped in my head. But we're talking about like how the 2005 Pride and Prejudice gets it wrong. Is there any reason why that decision would be made to, like, is it intentional or is it just that they feel like it would appeal to audiences to not be historically accurate?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question, and I'm not sure that I know the full answer to this as far as being in the composer's mind. What I have deduced from this is the fact that there's a lot of it where it's the adaptations are romanticized. And I think that part of that is the music is also romanticized in a way, in that it's a lot of times people think that classical music is inaccessible, and by classical I mean classical era music, as in the late 18th, early 19th century, where it has a little less depth to it for some people, and so they don't necessarily have as much of a connection to that music as they would to music that was a little bit later or that's written based on the later styles of the mid 19th century. So that I feel like would have some to do with it, to where it really helps to pull out more of the personalized style of creating an adaptation. But then again, you have movies like Emma that I feel like, and maybe because Emma is a little bit more cheeky, especially that particular adaptation, the music worked better in that way. But yeah, so like, especially even thinking between the 1995 Pride and Prejudice versus the 2005, just the overall tone that the music sets is different, and it gives just a little bit of it gives a different impression of the setting of what's happening as you're watching it. So that's the best, like, off the top of my head answer. But that's a great question and definitely worth looking more into.
I guess also there's, they hire historians, right? Music or costume historians, and it's got it's interpretation partly, right? It's partly scholarship, but it's also interpretation.
And also the film score composer wanting to put their own mark on it too, in a way. And then when you have the like, for instance, going back to the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, I mean, you have a fantastic film score composer and a fantastic pianist who's performing it on a piano, not on a pianoforte. So it's on performed on a modern piano. You get a little bit of that personalized influence on it as well.
Okay, here's my off-the-wall question. Oh, sorry.
There is a comment that just came in about the adaptations. I've heard that a lot of the dance music is a little old-fashioned, especially in 1995 Pride and Prejudice, because the older dances are slower and better for dialogue.
Yeah. Yes, because I mean, by the end of the 18th century, the dances were quite vigorous. They were not being walked the way they were in the Baroque era. So if you watch a dance like a minuet or a saraband that's being danced in the latter part of the 17th century, early part of the 18th century, they're a lot slower and they're much more stately. And by the time that these dances had evolved into the late 18th century, it was much more. They were much more upbeat. then again, the talking does come into effect with that. There's a great, I can't remember the name of the author. There's a great author who writes about this on a blog, a Jane Austen blog. Oh, I have to see if I can find out. It's not coming to me, but she goes through and she dissects every single dance and why this dance was correct and this dance wasn't. And the music doesn't work here because of this. And it's a really fun read to just go through and see, oh, they got it right here, or they did it here because they needed, to adapt to being able to have conversation that was taking place.
Yeah. I mean, if anybody knows that link, you could share it in the chat. Okay, so this is very off the wall, but you mentioned broadsides, and there was a definition of it that I hadn't understood before, I hadn't heard before. Normally, I think of broadsides in either as the newspaper kind of broadside, but also the military broadside as a kind of attack. I'm wondering,
right?
If is there any connection between those, or is there was there any music that played a pun on that kind of connection?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And because of the sheet that they would use to tack on or whatever, this is a lot of where the murder ballads come from too, where traveling musicians would go from town to town and they would create ballads on the death of or the experience of watching somebody being executed or hung or something like that. And so it's a very kind of a gory tradition, but it's a lot of, it's how news traveled from town to town. And that tradition actually travels to the US as well. And you have the murder ballads that are very popular in the Appalachian region. And then Dolly Parton actually does a great spin on that. I did a paper on this a couple of years ago where she kind of turns it around a little bit. But that was essentially where that kind of originated, was because they were printed, the lyrics were printed, and then that's how they were shared. This wouldn't have been in the early days of that, before printing took place, but more in the when printing was becoming more of a tradition.
Fascinating. I did not expect Dolly Parton to come up tonight.
Her murder ballads shift a little bit. A lot of times those murder ballads talked about how, especially, Appalachian ones where a woman is murdered by her lover, her husband, and Dolly Parton shifts it to where it's, the woman is not murdered. She survives. She's strong. She lives on. So it's Dolly Parton's America. It's a great podcast. This is totally off topic, but not really. There's a great episode on there where they talk about this. She shares a little bit about it too. It's a lot of fun.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So we have a possible response here.
I believe so. Yes. But she does more than just the Pride and Prejudice 1995. I believe that she does several of them. And if she doesn't, then maybe it's a different author. But that sounds right for that.
Well, I think probably we should stop there. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for all the great questions and for the hosting of the talk today.
Delicia. Okay.
Sorry, it's just a thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to everyone in our audience. Sorry, Inga, I thought you had that one.
Oh.
I thought that was my part. I'm like, oh.
So it was wonderful hearing. It was wonderful, Laura, hearing the music. That was terrific.
Thank you. Yes. And my music is available. I have a YouTube channel. I often post a lot of music on my Instagram, and those are all the Jane Austen playlist. So the videos, if there was any difficulty hearing some of the videos, or if there was any lag, those videos are also available on my Instagram and also on my YouTube. Okay. So I have quite a few there.
Do we have the links for those?
Somewhere? Yeah, I think we would be nice to
There.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right.
So this is the end of our Music in the Regency. And thanks again, Laura. So while we're all on summer break, you can view any of our previous programs on the website, Jane Austen and Co., which contains the archive of all our lectures, over 40 of them, on topics ranging from Austen's daily musical practice and music books to the work of Regency textile designer Anna Maria Garthwaite, to multicultural adaptations of Jane Austen's novels, topics on race in the Regency, and Austen and the Brontes. We've enjoyed bringing you this thought-provoking programming for the past 5.5 years, and we look forward to what's coming up in the fall after you all come to JASP in New Bern, North Carolina, right?
That's right. Well, that's what I was just going to say.
Yeah.
So please do consider joining us in person. You can meet everybody, say hi to us for the Jane Austen summer program in June. I think all 4 of us will be there. Well, Deb, are you going to be there? Yep, all 4 of us will be there, and Maisie too is off screen right now. So all of us. Thank you so much for attending tonight's presentation, and thank you again, Laura, for a delightful talk and performance. And people, if you're still in the audience, please consider donating. It really makes a difference for us and makes us able to continue this programming. Every contribution helps us continue to provide new Austen-related content. Have a good night, everybody.